Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 18 in our ongoing series, and although it's the 28th of December where I am, it's probably still the 27th where some of you are. We are going to stay on the day after Christmas just because so much happens on that day. To thoroughly sort of go through the information, I'm going to be referring today to three different narratives from the book by Detective Steve Thomas, John Bonet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. We're going to look at the early inconsistencies in John Ramsey's statements. Then we're going to dip into the death of innocence, just looking at some of the versions dealing with the early sort of response in terms of the police in being inside the Ramsey home in the sort of still in the morning hours and going up to possibly to the afternoon. It depends on how long this episode is. And then we'll also go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Now what we're going to be looking at is a couple of different things. We're going to be looking at the 911 call, but again in a different way. We're going to be looking at it in Death of Innocence, the way Patsy describes that call. We're going to look at the cops that arrived on the scene, including Detective Arndt. We're going to look at the ransom note. We're going to look at the words in the ransom note. We're going to look at the autopsy, but more in particular the circumstances surrounding the autopsy. Of course, to get there, we need to first go through the events on the day after Christmas. Now, I'm going to refer kind of glossingly through the timeline provided by PBWorks on the John Bonet site. I don't really like that timeline. I find it favors the Ramseys. It's kind of apologia. It's kind of biased towards the Ramseys in that sense. And as a result, or as such, it's sort of, I don't find it particularly reliable. It's not completely unreliable, but it's not absolutely reliable as far as I'm concerned. Now, nevertheless, I am going to be just referring to some of the timestamps based on their reference to some of the same sources that I'm using. And it is interesting that the timeline kind of leaves certain things out. So, for example, if it's referring to Officer French, nothing about his comments about the no footprints in the snow. That's what I kind of mean by that. Before we get started with today's episode, just a note that the next episode on this channel will just be dealing with the latest book that I've written, Silver Fox Post-Truth. I'll just be taking you through some of the reviews that's dealing with the Chris Watts case. Also, thank you very much to the last 100 or so subscribers of the last day or so. Thank you very much. Welcome to the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can click on the icon on the bottom right, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So we're going to start off by sort of glossing through the timeline, and there's just so much to go through, which is why you can literally spend days and days just examining that one day, especially the morning. The morning is chock full of details, and as a result I wrote a trilogy of books called The Day After Christmas. The trilogy don't only deal with the one day, but they certainly focus in absolutely exhaustive detail with the events that happened after in the aftermath of what happened to John Bonet Ramsey. So I'm going to kick off, but in a very light way, in a very superficial way. You can go and read the timeline yourself on your own in detail if you'd like to do that. But I'm just going to tick off the sort of timestamps and see how far we can get. And then I'm going to go into the deeper analysis provided by, for example, Detective Steve Thomas, talking about John Ramsey's statements and the Ramsey statements themselves, especially in their book. Their book is a great resource because it is giving they are happy to write this narrative and then print it and publish it, and then that is their final version of what they say happened. And bear in mind, it's written by both of them, so you'd imagine that they'd agree on it. So that is something they're signing off on, and it's a great way to cross-reference that with what the police say, what they said in their police statements, and what the Detective Thomas and others have said. Makes sense. Okay, so according to the PBWorks Timeline, Officer French arrived, and this was just before 6 a.m., and then Carl Veach and Rick French are reported to have responded to this 911 call. It was at 5:52 a.m. We're going to talk a little bit about that call. Someone asked me to go into a lot of detail about it and kind of analyze the call. I'm not going to do it at this point, just because I'm narrating an audio book where that call is dealt with it over like 10 pages. So for me, it's just a lot to sort of go through twice. Then Officer Rick French arrived at the defendant's home in a marked car a few minutes before 6. Now, bear in mind the ransom note says don't tell anyone kind of thing. And so they get a ransom note and they immediately ignore it. And the interesting thing is almost everyone kind of ignores it. It's almost like there's a kidnapping and then everyone forgets that there's a kidnapping. Anyway, then Detective Linda Arndt arrived shortly after 6 a.m. And then Officer French reads the ransom note. French said in a Vanity Fair interview that after he was greeted by Patsy, John directed him through the door and pointed out the handwritten note. So one's got to ask yourself at this point, if the Ramseys were guilty, did they of something? Did they sort of agree amongst themselves how they were going to handle the officer, how they were going to choreograph the scene, who's going to do what, say what, whatever? If the Ramseys were guilty of something, then you've also got to take it further than that and say, did they have sort of conversations later on about this is how we're going to approach this? We're not going to do this. We're going to try that. And you can kind of imagine that even going on when they hired lawyers. Again, if they were guilty of something. If they weren't guilty of something, you can still imagine them doing that. How are we going to approach this interview? How are we going to approach this discussion with the police? What is our strategy going to be? What are we going to do with Burke? And we're going to talk about that a little bit in this episode, how Burke was sequestered from the scene. Now, that is something that I think is quite interesting if you compare, again, the Ramseys to the McCanns. In the McCann case, you have a child abducted, that's quote-unquote abducted, and then the mother immediately runs out of the scene, leaving her 2 other children right by the window where they were abducted from, right? The other thing, just in the aftermath of the abduction, is that the McCanns kind of carry on as normal in Praia Deluge. They sort of leave their children at a daycare. I mean, afterwards they would criticize the hotel for their facilities being inadequate, but then they leave their kids in the daycare anyway, right? And so you have, as I say, you have the parents themselves accusing someone of being an abductor, but then nevertheless just leaving their children every day and carrying on with whatever they were doing, right? That's the McCanns. With the Ramseys, their child has just been kidnapped. There's a kidnapper on the loose. He's wanting money, and they then let their other child out the door, not with an officer, but with a civilian, and going out into the world while the ransom scenario is still being kind of negotiated. And you can kind of imagine that if this was a real kidnapping, that the kidnappers would be watching the home, and if they felt that something was violating their spiel, and then they see another child leaving the home, why wouldn't they kidnap that child? Does that make sense? So it is very crazy that they would let Burke out of the setup quite early in the whole thing. But we'll get to that. So then at between 6 and 7, Sergeant Paul Reichenbach, here's Officer French dispatched. Sergeant Robert Whitson receives a page to call Watch Supervisor Paul Reichenbach. Then Officer French searches the basement, and this is part of what is very unfortunate about this case, is that he is it feels like he's kind of directed through the scene by John, and so John basically shows him where he needs to go, and so he sees what John wants him to see. That's what one would kind of imagine in a sense. Anyway, as a result of this, whether John does so just purposefully or not, Officer French doesn't find his way into the wine cellar, which is where John Bonet is lying at that point. This also does raise the question, and it's a question that comes up a little bit later, is did John Ramsey go back into the basement at any point after the search where he chaperoned the officer through? Bear in mind, when John is chaperoning the officer, he's kind of seeing the scene through the officer's eyes, and if the officer's saying anything, John's sort of registering, right? So one question you could sort of ask is, was that suitcase under the window when Officer French went there, or was it there subsequently? Bear in mind that what French was looking for was a point of access, right? So he wasn't necessarily looking for a body in the house. He wasn't looking for John Bonet. He was looking at entrances and exits. And if he saw the wine cellar door, he was probably told, well, there's no door out of there. So that it would be pointless for the intruder to go through that entrance or be there, if that makes sense, okay? And so it would be interesting to have a recording of what was going on while they were in the basement. What's in here? Oh, no, that's just blah, 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 whatever. And it is, it's quite interesting to think about Rick French, the officer, how he must have felt after everything that happened. He may have blamed himself for years, even, today, that if only he'd opened that door, he could have stopped this terrible cloud that has sort of hung over Boulder ever since. In other words, he could have nipped this whole thing in the bud. It could have been not solved, but it could have been largely resolved much earlier. And if the officer had found John Bonet, he would not have permitted John Bonet to be carried upstairs and put on the carpet where the children had been playing on the 23rd. I don't know if you remember that. If the officer had found John Bonet instead of John Ramsey, he wouldn't have removed the duct tape from John Bonet's mouth, right? So let's just go into that in a little bit of detail now. So we've spoken quite a lot about pageantry, just the pageantry, of the ransom note, but also the pageantry of some of the people in the story. And now you have the pageantry of the crime scene, and the pageantry of the crime scene is this duct tape. The duct tape is kind of suggesting a kidnapper, that John Bonet mustn't cry out. Now, the duct tape was almost certainly applied post-mortem, so in other words, there was no reason really to put the duct tape on, other than to make the crime seem to be worse than it was, or how can I put it, to make it appear to be executed, let's say, by an adult, by a perpetrator who was quite sophisticated, like an assassin, right? Someone who had brought duct tape along and who was quite... It's something you often see in the movies. It's quite a sophisticated operation. When you take the duct tape away, then it starts to make you wonder what is going on here. Now, I've heard a lot of people saying that the garrote was also the sophisticated contraption. Actually, it isn't. If you look at the Chris Watts case, he didn't need to use a garrote. He didn't use a garrote on all three of his family members who apparently were asphyxiated. I don't personally believe that they were, but you can easily imagine that it is not so hard to subdue a small child, especially a girl, right? A small girl. And so why this overkill? Why this overkill in terms of not only the garrote, but also the blow to the head? Why both, kind of thing? And so, because John Bonet almost certainly would have died from either wound, so why have both? And I do think that that is a big clue to this case. So the duct tape is actually pageantry. The duct tape is making John Benet's crime scene look a certain way that it isn't. It's also imputing an intruder. Now, in the same way that the ransom note was written inside the house with a pen inside the house, and there was apparently a practice ransom note as well. There was just a strip of paper along the top that appeared also to be directed to something like Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, I think. And that note was then removed. There is also the theory that the duct tape actually came from inside the home. And there's a long story about that. I'm not going to go into that here, but I have written about it. The duct tape was thought to... It was actually a very rare kind of duct tape. It wasn't manufactured until recently at a particular outlet, so there's a whole story around that. But a theory was that the duct tape was actually removed from the backing of one of Patsy's paintings, and that's kind of where it came from. That was one of the theories. But the impression that some people had was also that the duct tape came from inside the home. We can go into the duct tape in more detail, but the point I think to bear in mind is that on the inside of the duct tape was an impression of the child's lips and fibers, and these fibers were consistent with some of the clothing of the family members, which implies that the duct tape was placed on John Benet's mouth by a family member, right? I think I'm not gonna take it further than that. That's the end of this preview. Thank you to those on YouTube for listening. If you want to watch the remainder of this episode, you can do so on Patreon. That's patreon.com/TCRS. Thank you for listening. So at 6:03, the whites arrived.